So just to begin, on the 31st of July 1992, 21 planning permission notices appeared in the Irish Times for a series of developments that would alter a large tract of the city centre, Dublin's Temple Bar. These planning applications for schemes within the Temple Bar Framework Plan were lodged to Dublin Corporation on behalf of Temple Bar Properties. Allow me to backtrack a little. So in the late 1980s, Dublin Corporation had issued road widening proposals for the quays that would have involved the destruction or partial removal of several riverfront structures. These intended measures, coupled with the proposal for a quayside transport hub, triggered a concern for the historic area between Dame Street and the River Liffey. The scheme for a colossal transportation hub spanning across the river was designed by American firm Skidmore, Owings and Merlo, shown here. And CIE had acquired numerous properties in the vicinity to facilitate its construction. Short leases were issued and cheap rents were available in the area, as many properties were earmarked for demolition in preparation for this development. In an article in the Architectural Review at the time, Catherine Slessor describes the temporary impact. This nurtured an eclectic, vibrant mixture of small-scale users, cafes, art galleries, shops, clothing factories, and recording studios, attracted by the cheap rents and bound together by a spirit of optimistic bohemianism. Needless to say, this heavy-handed proposal prompted widespread protest and sparked debate on the treatment of the city. The plight of Temple Bar, first named in Antashka's 1985 report, The Temple Bar Area, a Policy for Its Future, attracted political consideration, having gained press attention. The plans for the bus depot on the south side of the quays were eventually shelved in 1987, though the proposition of a transport hub on the North Quays remained an objective. In a landmark move, a state agency, Temple Bar Properties, was established following the Temple Bar Renewal and Development Act in 1991 to manage the reinvention of this area and oversee the creation of a new cultural quarter for the city. Consequently, a competition to develop an architectural framework plan for Temple Bar was announced. 12 practices were invited to enter, and Group 91 submitted the winning entry. 13 architects, a couple of whom are here, from 8 small architectural practices made up the Group 91 consortium. The group had formed in 1991 to celebrate Dublin's designation as the European City of Culture, but many of them had collaborated on urban proposals and exhibitions in the 1980s, which could now be tested. In tracing formative influences, it's interesting to note that many of the Group 91 architects had studied together in UCD, some under architect Ivor Smith, who was Professor of Architecture in UCD in the 1970s. Smith and his so-called Flying Circus cohort, which included Ed Jones, Kenneth Frampton, John Miller, Chris Cross and Niamh Brown, among others, would fly in from London to teach each week. The 1980s became a time of experimentation and reflection for many architectural practices in Dublin. With a lack of opportunity in building and construction, graduates sought experiences overseas, and having lived and worked abroad, a generation of young architects brought with them new ideas and attitudes to urban regeneration on their return home. In a 1984 article, Key Questions, in the Architect's Journal, Jerry Cahill, who we've just been hearing about, describes an exhibition highlighting the work of new emerging practitioners at the time, such as the City Architecture Studio, a collaborative group of young architects, many of whom would go on to form Group 91. The projects exhibited explored the challenges and potential of building in the city and sought to demonstrate how traditional building considerations and urban patterns can be incorporated into new designs. Fundamental to the principles of the City Architecture Studio was an aspiration to embrace what might be possible rather than what is probable. They staged a number of architectural exhibitions in the Blue Studio Gallery, at 42 Dawson Street, shown here, formerly the offices of de Block & Noir Architects. A living city was a key priority, while development plans for the city at the time promoted an exodus to the suburbs. In 1985, many of the architects involved had participated in the UCD Dublin City Quays project, which was led by Jerry Cahill, Lachlan Keeley and Cahill O'Neill. And in many senses, this celebration of what might be possible was enshrined in this endeavour. The writings of international architects and theorists such as Aldo Rossi, Leon Creer, Gunnar Asplund and Kenneth Frampton proved influential at this time. New theories of urban analysis and reconstruction were explored and disseminated through teaching and practice. Part of this new thinking involved a rejection of modernist ideals and a move towards a more contextual approach to urban development. Further afield, Colin Rowe's 1978 Collage City presented a critical re-examination of urban planning theory, redefining the role of the architect in the context of contemporary urban design. Rowe was preoccupied with urban form and was critical of the modernist approach to urban development. Like Rossi, he presented a study of the traditional city and explored the layered evolution of contemporary cities against the backdrop of classical theory. In practical terms, this contextualism is reflected in the work of Group 91, who sought to introduce contemporary elements into the historic setting of Temple Bar. In the period leading up to the Temple Bar competition in April 1991, Group 91 staged Making a Modern Street, as we heard from Ellen, an architectural exhibition which tested new ideas for urban living in the Liberties area of Dublin. The proposals were intended to be provocative, to ignite debate and to bring focus to the plight of Dublin's neglected inner city streets. They won the Temple Bar competition in the autumn of that same year. Derek Tynan recounts how they were the new kids on the block, hungry for work. The prize for the Temple Bar competition was to be a significant commission involving the design of a series of public spaces. The Group 91 framework plan encapsulated many of the ideologies and theories that had been explored in their collective endeavours in the 1980s. And in this regard, they were poised to tackle this challenging brief. Central to the Group 91 vision for Temple Bar was a re-inhabitation of the city. And their master plan featured the tagline, "A community of 3,000 citizens living in the city." Their design strategy prioritised an overview of the historic quarter and a regeneration of existing structures and streets rather than a tabula rasa approach to development. Pedestrian routes and public spaces were designed to connect a series of civic spaces or cultural clusters dotted through Temple Bar, opening up spaces within urban blocks that were largely decrepit or derelict. In this sense, O'Donnell and Toomey's Irish Film Centre was a pilot project for the regeneration of Temple Bar as a cultural quarter, with Slessor pronouncing it a standard bearer for the area's renaissances. Though completed in 1992, the IFC, now the IFI, had its origins in 1986, when a Centre for the National Film Institute was earmarked for Temple Bar. The brief was to provide a building that would accommodate various aspects of film culture. The site for the film centre was that of the former Quaker Meeting House and School, a collection of 9 buildings ranging in quality and scale and dating from as early as 1692. Sheila O'Donnell recounts how they adopted an archaeological approach to the existing structures on the site, measuring and mapping each remaining element. The design intention was to regenerate the layers within the complex blocks, retaining as much original fabric as possible whilst introducing new elements and interventions. To quote the architects, "Our site-specific strategy for the new film centre, comprising new interventions, surgical demolitions, simple conversion and invisible mending, was intended to continue the process of gradual change and incremental adaptation that had characterised the historical development of this site." The former meeting house complex had evolved and accumulated layers over centuries. The central atrium space, around which the workings of the IFI hinge, was formed on the footprint of the historic courtyard. The decision to locate the principal cinema in the former men's meeting room and the second cinema in the former women's meeting room informed the overall design strategy. The adjacent position of the screening rooms at right angles to each other meant that the projection suite could be strategically located between the two cinemas. Thus, auxiliary spaces could be organised accordingly within the remaining structures and voids. Though some losses were inevitable, the intervention was respectful of the historic fabric and displayed an in-depth understanding of the site. The balance between existing and new is carefully judged, allowing modern insertions to reanimate existing fabric. The palette of materials, stone, steel, brick, plaster, was chosen to reflect the modest character of the surrounding Temple Bar streets and warehouse buildings. One of the design intentions was to extend the public realm of the city into the centre of the urban block. And John Toomey recounts his delight on seeing a no bicycle sign posted on the wall of the foyer in the early days. The cinemas, by contrast, are comfortable lined spaces with the intimacy of a private room. Historic elements within the existing structure were retained, with window openings, cornices, and door surrounds emphasising the domestic scale. Part of the intrigue of this project is the way it manages to reveal the inner workings of a historic urban block, effectively turning it inside out and creating a lively urban space within. The film centre is embedded within the block, bound in by Eustace Street and Sycamore Street. O'Donnell and Toomey's intervention has no conspicuous street presence and is accessed by a series of narrow laneways which lead the visitor to the central atrium. The principal entrance is through the discreet pedimented doorway of number 6 Eustace Street. An illuminated film strip of etched glass set into the floor lines the dimly lit vaulted passageway and extends into the bright atrium space. The centre is also accessed from Meeting House Square and Sycamore Street via a raised courtyard concealing an archive store and workshop below, and previously from Dame Street through Cogle's Court. The inner atrium brings to mind Florian Bagel's Half Moon Theatre in London. The space is clearly theatrical. In a critique in The Irish Architect in 1992, Sean O'Leary notes the Cinecittà parallels, the rare and magical blend of film and cityscape that is found within the walls of the centre. He describes how the project magically balances substance with veneer and provides Dublin with a place where citizens' repressed desire for promenading can be relieved to a limited extent. The Group 91 Framework Plan envisaged a walk through Temple Bar, illustrated beautifully in their competition entry as a series of meandering routes within the historic infrastructure. The plan identified 3 new hearts which would animate the east-west pedestrian route through Temple Bar: Temple Bar Square, Meeting House Square, and Market Square. Meeting House Square is named after the Presbyterian Meeting House on Eustace Street, which dates from 1728, and the former Quaker Meeting House. Designed by Paul Keogh Architects and completed in 1995, Meeting House Square was intended to serve as an outdoor room, an open-air performance area. Formerly a surface car park, it was strategically located on various axes through Temple Bar. Conceived as a cultural hub, the square is formed by cultural buildings around its perimeter, namely Shane O'Toole and Michael Kelly's Arc Cultural Centre for Children in the former Meeting House, alongside O'Donnell and Toomey's Gallery of Photography and National Photographic Archive and their Irish Film Centre and Archive. The Gaiety School of Acting occupied the upper floors of Paul Keogh's Architects' mixed-use buildings, with Eden Restaurant by Tom DePuere occupying the ground floor. Meeting House Square, measuring 750 metres squared, was laid out in Wicklow granite, with sections of limestone inlaid to trace the intended east-west pedestrian route through it. 4 trees punctuated the west edge of the square, providing screening for the seating area outside the restaurant. Encased in a copper-clad proscenium arch, Santiago Calatrava's elaborate theatre curtain forms a centrepiece within the red brick facade of the Arc. Roving oak and steel wheelbarrow benches were designed for public use within the space. With seating on 2 levels, the benches were fitted with cast iron wheels to allow them to be moved around the square as required. Contemporary urban developments in Europe were a source of inspiration for Group 91 in the design of their framework plan. Paul Keogh recalls trips as a studio tutor in the UCD School of Architecture, in particular a visit to Barcelona, where the contemporary urban interventions and elegant public spaces made a distinct impression. He cites Bach and Mora's Plazas di Grazia as a particular influence, most notably their Plaza del Sol from 1985. As it happened, David Mackay, one of the assessors of the 1991 Temple Bar competition, was part of MBM architects who were responsible for several urban projects in Barcelona, most notably the design of the Olympic Village and Port for the 1992 Olympics. The creation of Meeting House Square was envisaged as part of a new urban sequence from Temple Bar Square and Curve Street through the square and on to Essex Street East, but also as part of a north-south route through the Irish Film Centre, connecting Dame Street to the Liffey. Magari Nieni's Pottle Bridge was designed to continue this route across to the North Quays, bringing footfall through the square, but this never materialised. Embedded within an adjacent urban block, Derek Tynan Architects' Printwork scheme lies the other side of Eustace Street. The site for the development was that of the former 2-storey Curtis Printworks on Temple Lane South, which dates from 1935 and was reclaimed as part of the scheme. The historic block within which the Printworks is located originally stretched south to Dame Street. However, in 1995, Curved Street was constructed through the block as part of the Group 91 framework plan. A ramped street designed to connect Curved Street to the Printworks through the block also formed part of the strategy, but remained an enclosed route within McCullum Mulvan's Music Centre. As in the case of the IFI, the Printworks development, a collection of 10 apartments, presents an understated exterior. Though the historic structures are only partially retained, the re-inhabitation of these elements established a scale and rhythm that belongs within its setting. The use of existing structures to Temple Lane and Essex Street East allows the Printworks to disappear within its context. Commercial units form a podium, creating a presence at street level, while the residential accommodation occupies a private world above. A double-height slot signals the entrance to the complex, giving way to a narrow staircase leading to a raised internal court. All the apartments are accessed from this datum, which was designed as a shared landscaped space. In addition to the hollowing out of the interior to form a central court, a series of private open spaces serve the apartments. This connection to external space is an essential feature of the development, eroding the density of the block. The stepping of volumes allows light to enter the rear of the Temple Lane studio, while the stepped facades internally and externally maximize light to the internal spaces. The sectional device allows the upper levels of the block to benefit from light and privacy, while creating a shared intimacy internally, which is far removed from the streets of Temple Bar below. The selection of materials reinforces this separation between the inner world and the street. Along the principal elevation to Essex Street East, a red brick skin references the neighbouring buildings in scale, materials, and fenestration pattern, while in the upper court, the aesthetic shifts, borrowing an industrial language and a material palette from the former Printworks. Raymond Ryan makes reference to the spirit of collage in the design process. The Printworks takes elements that already existed on the site, elements perhaps influenced by objects or surfaces in the neighbourhood, and new elements derived from the architect's own history, concerns, and analyses. That is all in the spirit of collage, or in 3 dimensions of assemblage. So to conclude, this paper highlights just 3 case studies within a much larger body of work in the Temple Bar area. Nearby Meeting House Square, the industrial elegance of McCullum Mulvan's Black Church print studio and Temple Bar Gallery and Studios enlivened the historic street of Temple Bar. And though McGarry-Niani's architects' Pottle Bridge never materialised, their Liffey boardwalk brought footfall to the North Quayside as the decade closed. Other 1990s developments in Temple Bar include Murray O'Leary's Green Building, an early testbed for sustainable design in the city, Grafton Architects' Temple Bar Square, and Arthur Gibney's restoration of the early 18th century house at 25 Eustace Street. Looking back on this phase of Dublin's history, what's particularly evident is the changing role of the architect in urban matters. Recalling the writings that were so influential at the time, architects turned to historic precedent for reference, examining and respecting existing urban patterns and forms. To quote John Ollie, "In Temple Bar, the fabric of the city is being recycled, whether in its standing form or by the reuse of its materials. The interventions of Group 91 are stitching new uses and activities into the spaces and buildings of the existing fabric. The urban tapestry is enriched, while its material worth is conserved, and an ecological alternative is formulated to suburban expansion and the process of destruction and rebuilding." Engagement with existing structures requires a very particular form of creativity. And as we reflect on architectural practice and its role and responsibilities in the context of the climate and biodiversity crises, we have no choice but to engage with our existing building stock. The complexities of the challenges we face today demand that we focus our attentions on urban regeneration and adaptive reuse. As part of my current PhD research, I'm exploring the 2011 UNESCO Historic Urban Landscape Recommendation as a teaching framework. This approach encourages the examination of historic landscapes as opposed to individual sites, viewed collectively with the layers of the social, environmental, and economic significance they represent. This systems approach is certainly evident in the Group 91 framework strategy. Naturally, the reality of implementing such a visionary framework plan has its challenges. The proliferation of so-called superpubs has stifled the reputation of Temple Bar as a cultural quarter. However, there is a lot to be learned from the approach. Dublin City was in a state of crisis in the 1980s, and the focus of the architect began to shift in response to widespread vacancy and dereliction throughout its centre. An emphasis on urban analysis and regeneration, combined with a lofty aspiration to embrace what might be possible rather than what is probable, led to the re-inhabitation and reanimation of vacant structures and lots. Historic sites, by their very nature, are resilient, ever evolving and adapting. Constant reinterpretation and continuity of use are key. Embracing a landscape approach, the framework plan was about working with historic structures and infrastructure to connect and create new civic space. Design intentions were underpinned by a practice of survey and observation, with less focus on object and more on reconfiguration of urban patterns and structures. Ultimately, it was about bringing life to the city and celebrating culture. And in the words of Aldo Rossi, one cannot make architecture without studying the condition of life in the city. Thank you.